Let's get talking about what it is that we have for you today on our sector trends, where the Retail Trade Association of Kenya, RETRAC, is a business membership organization that serves as an umbrella body for the retail trade sector in Kenya. Now, in partnership with Complex, a provider of retail management technology solutions, they've conducted a survey dubbed Retail Industry Outlook Survey, where 2020, where they delve into retail trends, challenges and future outlook. Now with that, we are in our retail sector, and how are we performing? And another question is, how can we evolve and do we better even in the face of this crisis that the economy is grappling with? Now, to discuss this, I'm joined by Wambui Mbarire, the Chief Executive Officer of the Retail Trade Association of Kenya. Madam Wambui, how are you doing? Good morning.
Morning to you, and thank you for having me.
Anytime. I want to start it from this perspective. That what came out is that you are actually upbeat about the retail sector's growth post the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if you look at the research, the findings that of the Trade Association of Kenya, 47% of the retailers that you actually spoke to are positive about the growth of their business despite the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's start with that number, 47%. Somebody looking at it will say, well, that's less than average. Why? Why do we have that sentiment among your members?
I think the thing that was most striking about the survey was that in spite of the challenges that have been, and interestingly enough, it was both in essential and non-essential retail, was that the year had started on an up, and there was a lot of positivity at the beginning. What was interesting was that positivity has continued in spite of the challenges that have been. There was a bit of a dampened mood, I think, in the first quarter of the pandemic, as particularly in what we call non-essential retail. And non-essential retail was the sector which even yourself, Simba, perhaps you were not going into during that, but no one was buying clothes, for example, or shoes, or accessories, because you do not know what is coming. You need to hold on to your money. The essential sector, which deals mainly with food, consumables, shall I say life essentials, that continued to work. We had a bit of a worry. First, we started with the rush. The rush had to do, if I use the supermarket as an example, with people stocking up for a coming season, stocking up to an unknown season, waiting to see what will happen. And that meant perhaps usually buy 2 packets of flour, you now bought 4, which in effect then had the dump talking about in the second quarter, because 4 packets really, you're not going to buy anymore until that expires. So then we had that dip, but immediately after that dip and the pushing of the curfew to 9 p.m., things picked up again. Consumers started going out and consuming, and hence there was a growth back to where the positivity was coming. If this is going to continue going back to where we started, then things are not looking too bad. So that is where the positivity comes from. And also, I mean, I'm sure you've heard that we are only second to South Africa in terms of how developed our retail sector is. It is also an indication of why the international firms look to come into our sector. So that positivity, that potential for growth keeps people interested in growing the sector.
Pretty much. But I want to go to another finding so that you help us understand why we have that. I mean, if you look at it, 32% of the businesses surveyed also projected expansion of new branches, whereas 21% averagely projected expansion of new business activities. Now, this where it starts to become interesting. However, 41% of the respondents cited adoption of e-commerce online stores. So talk to us about that this morning, Madam Wambui. I mean, yes, there is that positivity that things are going to get better post-COVID-19, and most of them want to get into more branch reopening. So talk to me, from where you're sitting this morning, have we covered the real estate sector? Has it covered the areas that it needs to cover in Kenya? If not so, where are we? And has the COVID-19 pandemic sort of shifted the real estate sector from the brick and mortar model to online model now?
Thank you, Simba. So in terms of coverage across the country, we usually say that formal sector covers about 30% only. 70% is still informal. That means that 30% is basically in urban center. We're still to grow into the rural areas where we have real brick and mortar. We have a lot of informal kiosks existing, but that hasn't been formalized to look like what we call our formal retail. So there's still potential there. And I like to give an example that one of the reasons some of our locals have never crossed the borders is based on that aspect, that there's still so much of the country to cover. There is really no need to first go conquer another country. Let's first deal with our own. And I'll use that example with ShopRite as well. Part of ShopRite's exit has to do with that thing in their head office. So not only are they live in Kenya, they live in West Africa. They're actually closing 15 branches in West Africa. So, and I say that to diffuse the thought that this is yet another sign of the challenges of local retail. Their living has nothing to do with the local retail. So we still have quite some space within which to cover local retail. There's still a lot of room for more brick and mortar. We just need to kind of move away from where we've concentrated it and start looking for it to the places that we do not have. To your question on the 41%, a lot of retailers pre-COVID had an online presence, but it was an inactive online presence. So that online presence has been activated. And the reason the 41 thought they would not be building anymore, moving out to any more brick and mortar for now, has to do with, can we now reinforce our online presence? Consumers are becoming more discerning. I use myself as an example, and I keep saying, I wasn't really an online shopper for groceries, for example. But COVID kind of wakes your mind up to the fact that fly is flat. So if I call Global and tell them, bring me 2 packets of Jogo, they can only bring me 2 packets of Jogo. So you wake up to the fact that there are non-essentials that you really don't have to walk into a supermarket for. You will simply need to call a number and get delivered. However, we will always have stuff that requires a touch and feel of the product. If you want to wear your bow tie, Simba, you want to see it before you order it. You want to try it on and see, does it work for me? So you will always aspire to get that in-store experience to buy it. So brick and mortar will continue growing. E-commerce will continue growing. And I said the two will complement each other. They are not in competition with each other. They will continue growing, where you do not have to open a branch to sell non-essentials or to sell everyday essentials. Let me call them everyday essentials. You will have the option of doing it online, but you will need to that touch and feel as you go forward. And for me, the perfect example is that Amazon has now opened a brick and mortar outlet. When they open brick and mortar, it shows that even they, who are supposed to be the largest of the e-commerce platforms, acknowledge the importance of that brick and mortar, and it would allow the two to work together. So they're going to grow together. People will consolidate their online presence, make it more effective. We still have a last mile challenge. So there is a challenge to how far our brick and mortar, how far our e-commerce will go. In urban areas, maybe it will grow faster. In rural areas, we have a bit of a challenge, and we might develop our own kind of e-commerce. We have Copia Kenya. Copia Kenya is technically doing e-commerce, but they do it within our circumstances. So they'll identify an agent in a rural area, and you will order and your staff will deliver there, and then you can pick. Because then you'll otherwise have to be talking about the green kiosk next to the Coca-Cola depot near where the border guys park, and it becomes a big challenge. So that is why I say e-commerce is not here to run out brick and mortar, it is here to complement.
Pretty much. If you may, I want to take you back to something that you've actually mentioned, and I just want us to make it clear this morning. Let me take you back to exactly how we looked at the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the different sectors and the industries of the economy. Well, maybe you might want to dispel that for us this morning, but retail sector was looked as at one of those defensive sectors that, yes, even as we're talking about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, people still have to live, people still have to put on, people still have to shop, people still have to go to get the essential commodities, especially in the cities as well, but the retail sector is really taking a very good hold. Would you therefore say that the effects have not been really that bad because the real estate sector falls in that defensive sector? People will still need it within this crisis.
So we for the COVID purposes, for that conversation, we usually say we ended up looking like we have two sectors. We have essential retail and we have non-essential retail. Essential retail was what you're referring to. People must eat. And I think from the onset, the government was very awake to that. In fact, I remember having a conversation and it was close supermarkets where we in Nairobi eat, because there was no, at that onset, there was no conversation about whether they would allow restaurants to remain open or not. But they were clear that people needed to access food, even if it's to cook at home. So that particular retail didn't really suffer. We had a very bad second quarter of that season, as I said, because of the, shall I say, hoarding that happened pre the curfew starting. When you stock up, it doesn't matter whether COVID goes away or not, you are going to wait until you finish consuming what you had. Now, the non-essential retail, that really suffered. And that also had an effect on real estate, because then if really no one is walking in to buy a shirt, for example, and my lease says I must be open, which means as long as the lease is running, I need to pay rent. So we also initiated discussions with our members and the retail and the real estate sector to see how do we mitigate, because post-COVID we will need each other. The property will need a tenant, and the tenant will need the space to continue selling his merchandise. So real estate did suffer, non-essential did suffer. Non-essential is only now beginning to wake up a bit. Restaurants also really had a very difficult time. Originally, they were allowed to open until 7, and when you open until 7 and public transport is not is declared as non-essential, you can't really open until 7, because one, who's coming after that? Two, how do your employees get home? So it ended up that most guys then ended up closed by 6. Supermarkets collectively agreed to close by 5:30, other than outside urban areas. So if your employees all live within the area, maybe you can push it to 6 o'clock. The 9 o'clock curfew was godsend, because that really now opened up the non-essential a bit, allowed restaurants to continue operating, because then the delivery units were allowed to work the curfew hours. But we are still seeing a struggle in non-essential. And non-essential, as I said, was fashion, apparel, etc. It's interesting to note that one of the sectors that seemed to have had an uplift during that area, interestingly enough, was furniture. Amazingly, and I guess it has everything to do with people spending more time at home. I say those people who don't usually spend too much time sitting on their couches, and here I would say read men, ended up thinking, my goodness, how do you guys even sit on this chair? And then you get an upgrade, or the TV at home is not the same size as what he watches when he watches his football in a sports bar. So he upgrades that. So we saw an upward trend in household appliances, furniture, bikes, sports equipment. People were actually becoming more healthy. And I guess there's a correlation with the fact that there were less people reporting to hospitals. So we had dynamics that were really interesting to watch as we went through that period.
Yes. Let's also talk about this. I know you've alluded to it when I asked you earlier on exactly what the outlook of the retail sector has been within the COVID-19 pandemic. But from where you seated this morning, somebody's going to ask you, what do you think is behind some of the struggles that the biggest retail chains in the country have been having in the economy? I mean, not a year ends before we hear somebody's closing shop, but also on the other side, you'll point a few that are on this sporadic expansion strategy within the economy. How do you balance those two ends from where you're sitting this morning?
I think let me first speak, because everyone points to it, on the failing element of retail. And I say this both for retail and for our suppliers. A lot of businesses in Kenya start from family. A lot of businesses in Kenya start from, if I use my own sector as an example, if you read the history of any of our big giants, it was a small shop that grew to this giant. Now, how did it grow? Was there structure to the growth? Did it wake up one day and suddenly we had 60 branches? And if we had 60 branches, what else grew with us? Did we grow our management structures accordingly? Did we grow our corporate governance accordingly? And those are the challenges. We're not growing. We have historically not grown our corporate governance at the same rate as the branches. We have not grown our structures in terms of management systems, inventory systems. We've not grown them, and it will come to bear at some point. Something has to give. I keep saying, if I'm running one shop, by the time I have 10 shops, I cannot run them effectively if I do not have structure with them. So that has been the challenge. The growth for physical outlets was not synonymous with the growth structure. Governance. And this is not for retail outlets only. This is actually across the board, even with our suppliers. But for some reason, we end up being in media more often than they on corporate governance. So that corporate governance is the reason. Now, for those that we see growing, it's the awakening to the importance of those things. They grew up maybe for about the last 5 years. Those who are growing have waken up to those challenges that, well, we must put our corporate governance in place. We must put structures that manage, especially our inventory, which is always a challenge. And once you can manage, have proper structures, manage your inventory well, have financial structures that make sure that you're on top of your cash flows, the downward trend that we've seen will definitely come to an end. So it has a lot to do with realizing that growth comes with systems, and those systems must be in place for one to survive.
Pretty much. Now, when I look at the challenges, I would like to really, therefore, sort of compartmentalize into what you have been blamed in the sector so much, is that you are over-concentrating yourself in the cities and major towns in the country. Do you think that the sector has a chance in the rural areas of the country, especially now that devolution has been with us for 10 years now? Would you say that you've met steps with that opportunity of devolution?
Yeah. Last 10 years, more branches have been opened in the rural areas. In the rural, let me not call them rural areas, in the county urban areas. The concentration is something we need.
Yes, we seem to have
those to the rural areas, into the counties, and there's real estate that can accommodate will follow. Have to so that we develop real estate that can in the county headquarters, for lack of a better word.
All right, as we clear this conversation this morning, we seem to have had a slight technical issue at that point. But let me ask you this morning, therefore. Everybody's talking about the optimism that we are riding on, that yes, our sectors are going to rebound post-COVID-19. Would you say that the signs are there now, especially with the relaxation of the COVID-19 control measures from the president? And when are we going to start talking about this turnaround?
I think the turnaround is already happening. I actually think the turnaround happened within COVID. Okay. And we've seen what people can come up, and given the right support, we have managed to achieve within those 6 months. The innovations around having equipment that we can use in our medical outlets without having to import it. So the turnaround started, and for me it's a challenge to the government of wake up to the possibilities of what we can achieve locally without having to import it. The possibility of a significant amount of import substitution. There's a lot of stuff that we can give facilitation to our own locals to produce so that we are able to start consuming a lot of our own. I challenge people often, what is Buy Kenya, Build Kenya, really? I mean, tell us, educate us on it. And the only way to do that is for suppliers and manufacturers to produce their stuff for the local market and promote it in the local market. The only way I will ask for a Kenyan-made product is because I know it's Kenyan, and it's because I've consumed it locally. If I go to any other African country or if I go to Europe, I will know it's Kenyan, so I will buy it, and that's how we'll promote our exports. But if I don't know it, even when I go abroad, I buy what I see there because I'm not really going to spend time reading the label to establish, let me buy this product because it's made from my country. So let's educate Kenyans on what is Kenyan. And this was at that wake-up moment. This was that wake-up moment. Let's promote what is local. Let's show Kenyans this is what it is. And then even as we are doing that, can the government then look at the cost of production? Because speaking from a retail point of view, sometimes it's cheaper to import a product that exists locally, but it will cost me half the price if I import it vis-a-vis